Welcome everybody. Welcome to this session, Accelerate Time to Value, Get More from Your Software Investment. So we have a full house. Looking forward to this session. Make sure you post your question in the Q&A. That's where we track them and make sure we get to all the answers. This is a live session, so I'd like to welcome the moderator of this session from Momenta Partners. Luke, welcome. The floor is yours.
Lucian, thank you so much, and welcome everybody to this great session. I'm excited. I'm pretty passionate about what we can do in manufacturing with software, and I'm pretty excited today to talk about accelerating time to value. I'm even more excited by the panel that we've brought together today to have a conversation on this topic. So with me today is John Dyke, CEO of Sesame, Tanya Cook, co-founder of Amplo, John Wetzel, co-founder of NextGen Group, Zev Arnold, Principal Director of Accenture, and Keith Chambers, VP of Operation Management Software for Aviva. So welcome, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to hear.
Good. So let's kick off. So we're here today to talk about accelerating time to value, but value in manufacturing, I think, is a challenging topic. I've been in this space about 20 years, and I still struggle with what do we mean by value. So maybe Zev, you could kick us off with how do we think about value in the context of manufacturing industries?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So if we're going to accelerate time to value, we should probably know what value is and maybe just build a little bit of context or structure around what we mean by that. So the naive answer, and I think the place where everybody starts is, well, value probably just means money. After all, you can pretty much commoditize everything. So if you can put dollars and cents behind it, that's probably value. And I think once upon a time that held a lot of sway. There's some things to think about. I mean, first, there's some really encouraging signs that executives across industries in general, and I think manufacturing in particular, are looking at value more than just shareholder value. They're looking at stakeholder value more broadly. We see a lot of folks leaning into topics around sustainability, carbon reduction, also taking care of their employees, taking care of the communities around them. So we've already started to expand beyond shareholder value to stakeholder value. I think that helps. But if we're looking at, well, now how do we apply technology to really go make a difference there? That it's a good definition to look at stakeholder value, but it's probably not detailed enough to give us the direction we need to go do anything useful. I've come to think about value in manufacturing, and especially with industrial IoT, in sort of four broad categories. So the first category, and I think this may be where we're the most mature as a practice of technologists, is asset reliability. So looking at an asset in its individuality, right, as a unit, how can we reduce the amount of maintenance? How can we ensure its uptime? How can we ensure that it's running as planned? So I'd say asset and equipment reliability or reliability in general is one aspect. I think the second aspect is performance. So it's typically not enough to just look at a piece of equipment in isolation. You need to understand the process that it's a part of. You need to look at that process as a whole and think about how you can run that process more efficiently. So for instance, if you're monitoring a well pad, it's not enough to just say, is my separator functioning correctly? There's a lot of additional value to be found by looking at the process as a whole. Am I running this process as efficiently as possible? Maybe that's throughput of oil in a well pad. Maybe the efficiency of your process. Maybe your process is your quality when you come to pharmaceuticals. In discrete manufacturing, maybe it's the amount of items you're able to produce over time. So reliability, right, assets, process performance. Then the other two are the ones that I think are overlooked the most often, but just can have tremendous value. So the first one is safety. We all talk about safety. Safety doesn't go back to numbers directly, but it's about protecting our people who are working in sometimes very hazardous situations. What can we be doing to ensure safety? What can we do in a nuclear plant to ensure that we're providing radiation monitoring? And how can we revolutionize radiation monitoring with industrial IoT? So I'd say safety is a third one. And then the fourth one is regulatory compliance. Regulatory regimes are changing rapidly. We're seeing we're seeing maybe back and forth changes in the United States. I think globally, all governments are putting more emphasis, especially on climate change, but across the board on how we regulate heavy industries. So what can we do to deliver value to, as I think about our manufacturing clients, in securing their license to operate and improving their regulatory position? And that can deliver tremendous value. There's a company I've worked with called Aquila. They work with offshore drilling, and they've done a step change in applying industrial IoT to offshore drilling, in large part by improving the way regulators can monitor the equipment, which allows them to change the regulatory regime, which allows everybody to produce oil and gas more efficiently. So those are my 4 ways I think about value in this space: is equipment reliability, process performance, safety, regulatory.
I love that, Zev. I think that's perfect. It's almost like you're zooming out, right? You're starting down at the asset level. You're zooming out a little bit further to see the process. You're zooming out a little bit further to see the people running the process. And then the big macro government kind of level or geographical level view from a regulatory compliance perspective. I think that's spot on. Anything from the team that you would add? Anything we missed from a value perspective? Perfect.
I would perhaps briefly comment, Luke, that the various stakeholder sets that come to these types of manufacturing challenges to help come alongside these manufacturers and help them have a lens through which they see these problems. And it's typically either people or process or technology. And the value proposition and the scope of the solution generally reflects the core competencies of that stakeholder set. And I think, having been in the technology world most of my career, they would say it's not just about technology. In fact, the technology is kind of a given. It's about people and process, and we kind of pay the lip service thing to the people in the process, and then go back to selling technology. And I think Zev's framework, I think, is really important. It's holistic and it's comprehensive, and it's important. It's important for the manufacturers to hold this ecosystem, the stakeholders that are there to help them develop and implement and sustain these solutions, to really think about this holistically, especially the people part. We have not done a great job historically engaging the various stakeholders in manufacturing to build these and sustain these solutions, I think, over the long haul.
I think that's spot on. I actually did a post on it this morning on LinkedIn around people, process, and tech. And I suspect for today, as we talk about accelerating time to value for manufacturing IT, I think we're going to talk a lot about, or what we probably should call OT, but what we're going to talk a lot about is people, process, and technology. So maybe, John, sticking with you for a second, and this is a big question, and it's what we're here to talk about today. Maybe you can give a brief overview on what you think manufacturing companies can be doing to accelerate time to value.
Yeah, so I think we've all heard about pilot purgatory. I think we're probably a little tired of hearing about pilot purgatory. But I think it's important to recognize that pilot purgatory is actually probably more a function of the third industrial revolution and the behaviors and the capabilities that we've sustained even over the last 11 years of talking about Industry 4.0 than anything else. In fact, what I've begun observing and trying to raise awareness on is this notion of use case purgatory. The idea that for the last 40 years, various manufacturing stakeholder groups have identified problems. They bring in a vendor and a partner to help them implement these problems. And what have they done? They've created dozens, literally, within sort of the sanctioned portfolio of manufacturing IT systems. They have and have to sustain dozens and dozens of data silos, stovepipe architectures. And frankly, as we think about the fourth industrial revolution, AI, machine learning, augmented reality, the digital worker, connected worker, all of these new capabilities that are, in theory, available for us to choose from, those manufacturing IT organizations are spending 98 cents of every dollar they have to keep the lights on that legacy sort of set of data silos that they have out there. And when we come along with these use cases, these next pilots and use cases, we're just adding to that mess. We're creating new data silos and new stovepipe architectures. And so back to the people, process, and technologies, these use cases are clearly what's driving investment in this space. I think the manufacturers and this entire ecosystem have to focus on the reality that that legacy approach to building data silos and stovepipe infrastructure and architectures is no longer acceptable, is no longer sufficient, and that the proprietary ways, platforms, capabilities, solutions that have marked the past 4 years of Industry 4.0, the current last decade notwithstanding, I think we have to bring this ecosystem forward with new ways and with new capabilities that don't allow that use case purgatory in terms of these legacy architectures to propagate anymore.
I think that's spot on, and I always joke that only engineers would try and define a revolution before it's happened, but right, we're so obsessed with trying to figure out what is Industry 3.0, what is 4.0, and now what is 5.0. And I think we've really got to be down to your point at the use case level, not getting ourselves into pilot purgatory. And I think that term has been overused, but I love, that idea of use case purgatory, I think is spot on. So maybe Tanya, over to you. I think from my perspective, again, not to spend too much time on the 3.0 versus 4.0, but I think from an industry technology perspective, from an OT perspective, I think the technology has changed. So what do you think has changed about the nature of software that's maybe making some of our more legacy approaches outdated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there were a few key changes like in the last year, and I think I want to talk about 3 of them. So the biggest change for sure is like the shift towards cloud computing. So you have now a cloud infrastructure where you can do like computing on demand, which is totally different than a few years ago. Then the second thing is, I think you see this also in the production floor, like the mobile devices got super important. So I think the companies you see also in manufacturing or in the production floor, they really change to a mobile first approach. So you have a lot of operators, for example, which have a smartphone to do some maintenance jobs, for example. So this, I think, is the second key change which happened. And the third one, which is like more when we think about AI and everything, or augmented reality and virtual reality, is the use of open source software. So at the moment, what we see is that innovation happens much faster when we look into software development or like into AI, for example, all those open source AI models that are available, which can be used to like really do a lot of great things. And yeah, for me, those are the 3 key changes in software, like in the nature of software that changed.
I think that's perfect. I love those 3, right? Cloud, mobility, open source. I mean, we've all seen the impact that ChatGPT has had on our social media feeds in the last 4 days, right, or week since it was released. And I think the power of open source, especially AI, is great. What's been your experience? Not to put you on the spot for a second, but what's been your experience? You mentioned the speed to innovation that can happen with open source. Open source, I think, for a lot of enterprise customers that I work with, at least, is kind of a scary term. Should we be scared of it, or should we be embracing open source?
So I'm a big fan of open source. I think we should totally embrace it. The main reason is just because innovation then happens much faster, in my opinion. And of course, you can always build on top of open source. So as we started our company, we had like those open source AI models that we use that we just put into a platform. So we sold it as like the platform experience, but in the end, you had AI models that were open source. So I think for enterprise, they just have to look into like a way of how can they make it profitable.
I think that's perfect. And I think even if you look at the last few months, and you've seen a lot of big players shut down their IoT platforms or sell off their IoT platforms. So I think there's no assurances in this space, whether you go open source or big enterprise, you're still running a risk of maybe not getting the longevity you're looking for, and potentially open source gives you a safer bet now in the future. Any thoughts from the team on open source? Any experiences using open source in your world? And I think for manufacturing, it's a great place to explore.
I'll jump in for a second, Luke. I was reflecting as I was listening to you, Tanya. When I started my career, and I run into a tough software problem, and I'm like, all right, I just need a little bit of code to go solve this. And so I pulled an open source library to go roll out something that was going to fix the problem. And my manager came down on me hard. He was like, this is a super major oil and gas company. You can't just be rolling out open source software that doesn't have any support model behind it or anything like that. And it's just been transformational since the beginning of my career to now, where I talk to IT departments, and the first question they ask is there an open source solution we should be considering for this, rather than necessarily buying a commercial off the shelf, closed system. So I think that comment, it really resonated with me, and it's been fun to see that transformation over time. And certainly it's a lot fun programming nowadays when you can just grab packages and sort of short circuit the fun parts of coding. So
perfect. Yeah, I love that example. Thanks, Ev. So maybe Keith, over to you.
Okay.
So from a software vendor perspective, and this is again is one of these big questions, but what's the right approach to speeding time to value for IT and manufacturing, or OT manufacturing?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a statistic that goes around. I think it originally came from Gartner, but the statistic is that 3 out of 5 smart factory initiatives stall out within 3 years of their initiation. And there's always, lots of reasons why these things don't succeed or don't move forward. In our experience, the approach that kind of drives the greatest success, and I think Zev and John also touched on this earlier, is when you start there, there's always that mantra of kind of start small, fail fast. But even in that kind of approach, when you start, pay attention to the data. John talked about stovepipe architectures and silos of data. If all you're doing is kind of creating some more of that, it's probably not going to be successful in the long term. You may get some short-term kind of gain from it. So pay attention to the data and the ability to move and share the data. You need a secure data infrastructure. This is kind of you don't have to build a digital twin on your first outing, but you need to be thinking, really good data architectures rarely happen spontaneously. So spend a little time up front around what your data architecture should be, even if you're only doing some pieces of it. The second part I would say is really align what you're doing with how you run the plant, with the operating model. The people that are in your plant have specific things that they need to do. They need to know the plan. They need to know where they are in the plan. They need to know when there's a problem. They need to know how to connect and reach out to other people to get help. There's kind of certain enablers, I guess, that need to happen around kind of making software successful and driving value. And so it's very important to in these start small, fail fast type endeavors to really think about how am I adding to the performance of the people? How am I enabling people to add value to what they do in their day-to-day jobs? And then the final third part of it, and again going back to that kind of first piece about data and think about your data architecture, is plan to be able to scale and sustain the solutions. Again, putting in a wonderful little point solution that added a ton of value for someone, but doing it in a way that can't be moved, taken, expanded, rolled out to other facilities. Again, very, very limiting. So those are really the three I would say. Think about the data platform and your data architecture. Look at how you're going to integrate this into how the people in the plant are working. And then finally, have a plan to be able to scale and sustain the solution to really maximize the value.
I think they're a great three to start with. I think data infrastructure I was just talking about this morning. Data ops as a whole category that we probably haven't focused on in manufacturing before has become critical. And I think it's sometimes unusual when we start talking about these things. Everyone expects us to start with, oh, you should talk about the people. And you mentioned the people, and they're absolutely critical. But I think with the rise of Industry 4.0, data has become a real challenge, and how you manage data correctly and extract value from it and how you move it around your plant is so important. And then the people aspect, I think you're spot on there. I think, you know, one of the tools I love to use is design thinking, or it's probably more a school of thought than a tool. But how you engage users, how you work with operators, how you work on the shop floor, listen to their needs and bake it in. And then scale. Yeah, I mean, I think John hit on this early, right? How do we scale some of these solutions and not get stuck with just more technical debt just because it's the fourth industrial revolution, just because we've called it smart manufacturing or smart factories, or you've built a digital twin, doesn't mean you're magically going to be able to scale. So I think that's hugely important.
Yeah, and the second of those, the people, there's kind of a topic there that's worth kind of deep diving into at some point for people to think about, but really about how do you drive performance from the plant floor people. It's one thing to empower, enable them, give them the data that they need to do their jobs. It's another thing to have them in an environment where they can really maximize their contribution as they do their work. And this is something that we're seeing a lot of our customers start to pay a lot of attention to, is how do I really kind of build this performance type culture for my people? Not just how do I give them the data that they need, because maybe they're not able to use it effectively.
Yeah, or I think with data, in my experience, comes a lot of fear. I think if the culture isn't there it's sort of a typical Toyota production system culture, but you know, raise up an issue and everyone run to the issue and address it together. That's not always the culture that you find. And if you're suddenly unveiling new data and new insights, maybe not everyone wants to see it. So I think that cultural part is absolutely huge.
Yeah, and the whole industry is kind of littered with examples of OEEs and plants where the plant had 80% OEE until they measured it, and then it became a 60% OEE, and the plant manager didn't want to know about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's one of the big challenges we face. So maybe, Jim, over to you for a second. A hot topic at the moment, especially with the rise of Industry 4.0, and again, I'm not a huge fan of that term, but we'll stick with it for today. The hot topic is interoperability, and I think it's a vital enabler to have interoperability. But I think the solution providers we're all comfortable working with, it maybe has not been a priority over the last few years to drive interoperability, whether that's their own strategy or just a function of some legacy software. But I think it's of strategic importance that we figure out how to work with the ecosystem and all work together to drive interoperability. I'd love your opinion on that topic and what your experience has been.
Yeah, great. It's an awesome question, Luke. I would kind of start with kind of jumping off from where John ended on the first question. I would say, Houston, we have a market failure. The way software vendors go to market, the way they're compensated with licenses and all that kind of stuff, has really generated a stovepipe mentality on the solution space, and actually goes counter to interoperability. If I look at the heritage, what got us here, monolithic, large suite-based systems, proprietary protected data infrastructures and taxonomies, does not blend well with Tanya's talk about open systems and cloud computing and all that kind of stuff. So we've got this force going at us right now because technology has enabled us to at least talk about interoperability in actually a doable manner. In the old traditional approaches, to be able to get interoperability between silos of vendor software required APIs and a lot of hard work to exchange data between applications. And at the end of the day, you know, some of my programmers would ultimately say, Jim, at the end of the day, to actually have a value creative ecosystem, it's a large exercise in mapping. I've got to map data because the taxonomies from your ERP does not match the taxonomy that's in your maintenance package, which does not match the taxonomy that's in your production model. And matter of fact, most organizations don't even have some of those. And so as you think about this, and I've said this in other venues, without interoperability, you end up with an ecosystem of stuff. And each thing that you're trying to do has its own stack. And I don't care if it's an open system, a closed system, whatever, but it's a siloed stack. And that's primarily Industry 3.0 kind of capability where you're building solutions for purpose. We've now put lipstick on the pig and called most of the Industry 3.0 stuff Industry 4.0. We just, not because it's different, it's just because we're trying to rename it. And you end up with systems that have hidden technology in them that you don't understand, that you don't know where they're going. I do have an issue with some of this stolen code stuff where you're taking open code, slapping it into your product, and now you don't know how it works. And when it breaks, you go, well, where did that come from? And so this lack of interoperability becomes a mess. And I know what John's trying to work on at SASME is trying to create a platform and try to create stacks of technology that kind of break through this. But today, it's just a freaking mess. And, you know, you think about machine builders and OEMs as they're trying to provide kind of a turnkey piece of equipment that has control, it has automation, it has information. They've had to build some sort of a stack in there, some sort of a data model in there that probably confounds this problem. And so not doing this with arms locked and having a business model that enables them to be compensated. So I still go back to that the business model of software manufacturers in the manufacturing space does not lend itself to interoperability. How they get compensated is broken. So I'll stop there.
Jim, I love it. I think you've said so much and so much relevant stuff. And I think we could coin the phrase the industrial ecosystem of stuff. I think that's absolutely perfect. So let's open it up to the group. What and John, you're probably expert in this with the work you're doing at SASME, but to Jim's point, I tend to agree, whether it's the business model between the machine builder, the OEM and the end user in the plant, or it's the business model between the software vendor and the end user in the plant, it is incentivizing a very locked down type of behavior when it comes to data interoperability. What can we do to change the business model to have a more open approach? Because I think, to me, and I'm pretty passionate about business models in the work that I do, but what's the new way in which we share value so that we can get more open in terms of data?
Yeah, Luke, can I jump in here? Because as a software vendor, I'd have to say, put my hand up guilty. So Aviva.
Oh, thank you for that.
No, Aviva has, I don't know, well over 100 different products that we have across our portfolio, well over. And one of the things that we've learned, and really something that's driving our strategy as a software vendor now, is exactly, Jim, the point that you were talking about, interoperability. And we came from a place back in Wonderware days of interconnection and integration, and we've never kind of really forgotten those roots. So the recent acquisition that Aviva did of OSI Pi to bring OSIsoft to bring the Pi system in, it was really a pivotal moment for us because it was, when you look at that business was about kind of independence. So they did data, Pi systems, but that was really all they did. They had a very, very light, if any, application stack that sat on top of it, but they had a huge network of partners that could access and share the data. And that approach is being largely adopted into our business now, the same concept. So we need to have an agnostic data set that goes across everyone. And sure, Aviva's applications sit and work very well and natively with that data set. But the purpose of the data set isn't just for our applications. It's for the customer and their use and their ability to fuel whatever stack they may put up. So that's kind of just the Aviva response, or the Aviva kind of strategy moving forward as we move forward, is to really try and kind of address exactly what you're talking about, Jim, to try and abstract out that data, make it available everywhere, and then add value through applications on top of it, but not lock it up.
Well, I, for one, am very happy to hear that. I think if folks haven't been following Aviva in recent months and years, we're seeing a consolidation of the stack across industry, and Aviva is kind of leading the charge. And I think if you guys aren't going to drive this level of open architecture and openness, we're going to be in big trouble. But just to go back to maybe the business model for a second, and we pioneered, I used to work at GE, John, you were there for a while as well. Well, GE Fanuc, I think, for you, but we pioneered some of these new business models where you're charging for the outcome, you're not charging for the data or charging for the software. What role do you think some of these new business models will play in the future when it comes to smart manufacturing or Industry 4.0?
Yeah, so I think sort of it's important to dovetail that conversation into the conversation that Keith just brought up and that Jim started. The marketplace will go where the incentives are. We're all coin operated, and each stakeholder, the systems integrators, the machine builders, the technology providers, OT and IT, software vendors, and of course the manufacturers that are footing the bill, we all go where the money takes us, right? And where the costs are. And I think it's important, by the way, to just as to sit in the parking lot for the moment, but the idea that this entire conversation is about large enterprises. Small, mid-sized manufacturers have almost no likelihood on the current trajectory of engaging in digital transformation and smart manufacturing unless we change this entire business model to the point where we reduce cost and complexity. We talk about accelerating democratization of smart manufacturing. Unless we can do that, reduce cost and complexity, the big folks will continue to invest because they have the deep pockets. The small, medium manufacturers will struggle. A few of them will engage because they have to, but as a whole, they will not. So it all kind of comes back to this idea. I believe that interoperability, and I appreciate what Aviva's doing. I think some of the great brands in the space are doing this, but they're still doing it from a vendor's perspective. And I think interoperability can't happen at a vendor level. It has to happen as an ecosystem. And so Jim is exactly right in saying that the entire ecosystem has to buy into these ideas. The entire ecosystem has to engage. And ironically, in Europe and in Asia, some of these ideas around interoperability and common information models are much more broadly understood and are being adopted at a much greater rate than in the US. In fact, North America is falling significantly behind Europe and Asia in terms of the adoption of these technologies of business transformation capabilities around manufacturing. So I think we can't move the needle for a vendor without moving the needle for the implementers, the integrators, for the machine builders, and of course for the manufacturers. And so I believe it takes an organization outside of the technology provider ecosystem, and that this is what our mandate from the federal government happens to be, is to accelerate the democratization of smart manufacturing through the creation of sensors, models, platforms, analytics, all these different smart manufacturing capabilities. And ironically, it's an ecosystem challenge and opportunity to bring both the open sourcing, the crowdsourcing mindset to the table, to OT, in ways that IT has built significant capabilities and muscle memory for 2 decades or more, right? So we have to bring some of those capabilities into the OT space. I think fundamentally that starts with this idea of infrastructure, not dissimilar to what OSI Soft and Pi have done in the continuous process industries from a vendor perspective, sort of bringing data collection and contextualization infrastructure to the masses in a very open source and crowdsourced kind of way. And that's part of what SESME is doing, in addition to the education and the driving these ideas into the marketplace. We've just recently, and I'll end with this, we've just recently announced the formation of a Smart Manufacturing Executive Council. It's 22 Fortune 500 manufacturing company executives with both OT and IT experience and business and technology experience to advocate for this idea of interoperability, to advocate for the value of democratizing smart manufacturing, and to tell this ecosystem, you need to engage. This is no longer sufficient. If you're not engaged in some of these important ideas and advocating for these and working on these ideas, we will not be able to work with you in the years to come. So I think that transformation, that disruption is starting, but it has to start, as they say, as the tide rises, all boats float higher. If the tide doesn't rise for every one of those stakeholder groups, that business model is broken, and we will be here 10 years ago talking about the same levels of cost and complexity, and manufacturers will not be adopting at scale.
Yeah, and John, I'd just like to add just a couple things on as well. You know, when we talk about small and mediums, that really represents 98 to 99% of the marketplace in here, right? So when we talk about large companies, they're 1% of the manufacturers in the United States. So 98 to 99% of the manufacturers in the United States are underserved.
Yep.
And in this interoperability issue, they don't have the same capabilities to actually ingest and do this. And so from a vendor standpoint, this is the long tail of the curve. So most vendors are working with the large companies because that's their business model. They can make money with large accounts. They can handle a few large accounts. But if you add up all the software vendors in the manufacturing space and look at the number of customers that they actually have, a lot of these software vendors are very proud to be well thought of in the space and have a few thousand customers. That's the tip of the spear. So what if these companies had 100 or 200,000 customers that are using their manufacturing software? What would that look like? In today's world, that current business model of those vendors would not scale to 100 to 200,000. Maybe it scales if they became open source. Maybe it scales if they really went after interoperability. But that's why I led with the model's broken, because John is talking about rising the tide for all, but our model doesn't enable that. The tail of the curve is too long. The profitability isn't there in the current approaches. And so the dawn is to really get after Industry 4.0. We've got to change.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue into a question I have for Tanya. And I imagine, you know, if I just came from one of my own startup, and before I joined Momenta, and I was pretty excited by exactly the challenge and the opportunity that Jim is talking about, right? You can almost leapfrog the big players, leapfrog some of the enterprise customers, and jump to, what do you want to call it, Industry 4.0 or 5.0 or digital twin or digital transformation, whatever the buzzword is. So keeping a little bit on topic around interoperability, let's talk about connectivity. So do you think connectivity, Tanya, on the shop floor is going to become commoditized? Is it just going to become a given?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I really liked what John and Jim talked about the last minute. So I have a few thoughts on that as well. So I think really for the small businesses or the mid-sized businesses, it's super important to have like an off-the-shelf solution, right? That they can use it. So what does it mean, like an off-the-shelf solution? They can't pay those huge integration costs that you have at the moment with like the professional services, for example, if you have to integrate everything. And I think that at the moment is due to like when we come to connectivity, the communication protocols, for example, that you have in a production floor, they're not streamlined at the moment. So there are a lot of different communication protocols, for example. And I think as long as we don't streamline that as like a community, that everyone has the same communication protocols, it's super hard to have like the connectivity or like a software solution for those small businesses, which is easy to implement. So I think from the connectivity side, that this is still not streamlined is a huge problem. On the other hand, for the connectivity, what you see at the moment, so for example, if you go more into tech or hardware, like a gateway, for example, which allows you to send data to the cloud, is getting a commodity. So it's easy to get that also as a small business. The only tricky part at the moment is like that the communication is always a little bit different. So you have to customize this part. But yeah, so I really hope that those communication protocols get like more streamlined. So also the smaller companies have a solution which doesn't use a lot of integration and customization.
Perfect. I think that's spot on. I'm hopeful about the future. I think if we can solve connectivity and interoperability, we're going to be able to accelerate to some of the outcomes that we've talked about. When it comes to accelerating to outcomes, John, you mentioned something previously that I think that it's so important. And I was sitting with a founder that I have a lot of respect for in the Valley recently, and we're talking about the adoption of Industry 4.0. And her point of view was that the kind of dichotomy we've got to live with in the US is that we're going to be the ones that create a lot of the technology, but the adoption is going to come from Europe and Asia. And I think you're starting to see that. So with productivity declining here in the US for the past 10 years, what can we do to accelerate the democratization and adoption of smart manufacturing? And actually, just quickly before you answer, just a bit of housekeeping. I should have mentioned this at the top of the panel, but please do enter your questions in the Q&A section for today's panel, and we'll get to those in about 8 minutes. Sorry, John.
Yeah, no, perfect. I love the question. I think it's somewhat ironic, and it's not coincidental actually, that the last 11 years that we've been talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and I'm sure we all remember the pundits and the analysts talking about $10 trillion of value creation over this past decade, and 3.8 trillion roughly of which was going to be created in the manufacturing space. And it's that 11 years, that set of 11 years, over which, for the first time in recorded history, manufacturing productivity by worker has first plateaued and then declined. And so I think it's incumbent upon, and I appreciate Keith kind of putting up his hand, saying, yeah, that's kind of my fault. And I've been in the same space with Keith prior to coming to SESME, building these to the best of our abilities, building great solutions that have helped many manufacturers over the last 4 decades. But frankly, I think it's incumbent upon all of us at this point in the game, as we see what's happening around us, to really deeply understand why that productivity gap has arisen here in the US. It's not the same actually in Europe, and it's clearly not the same in Asia. And there are geopolitics involved, and there's economic policies involved. But I think there's a significant challenge around this technical debt that I alluded to before, the complexity almost uniquely here in the US that we've created for ourselves in building these legacy vendor lock-in, data siloed, stovepiped architectures that prohibits US manufacturers from innovating. We have these great new capabilities, and Tanya, you did a great job of listing them. I think Zev, you talked about the value of these things. There's no doubt that we have created value for manufacturing, and we've enabled that productivity rise. In fact, your company, Keith Chambers, with Wonderware, I think was the last great disruptive innovation when you enabled a whole new ecosystem of these plant floor engineers to create value with their keyboard, with your InTouch Wonderware suite. That was the most innovative thing to happen in the third industrial revolution. And I think we're poised in the same way for that innovation to happen in the fourth industrial revolution, but we're not there yet. And so I think the difference today is that a vendor-centric approach is not acceptable. We have to engage as an ecosystem to create value, to enable crowdsourcing. The fact that still today, every single implementer starts from scratch in every single product and technology platform to build a model, to build the infrastructure where rule of thumb has it, 80% of the cost and time is in building that model, and 20% of your time is in building value, creating value. That's a travesty. Europe understands that. Europe is convening machine builders, systems integrators, manufacturers, vendors to focus on building common information models. That's at the core, even though it's technical and it sounds somewhat geeky, the best manufacturers in the US are engaging with us here at SESME to propagate those ideas, to help build value in data engineering, context creation that can be crowdsourced, and it isn't tied to a vendor stack. I think that's at the foundation of how we begin accelerating value creation, driving productivity, bringing lean thinking and operations, technology, and IT together in the same way. I think we just did a smart manufacturing survey recently. We were shocked to find out that a low single-digit percentage of manufacturing actually have their digital transformation / smart manufacturing / factory of the future initiatives actually tied to their lean manufacturing or continuous improvement strategies. That's a travesty, right? I think this is part of the silo mentality that we've created here, not just the technology, it's the people in the process silos that have to be threaded and dovetailed together to bring this next wave of productivity. Lean transformation, continuous improvement has been shackled by this complexity and this technical debt that we've created. All of that we believe can be reignited for another major step leap forward in innovation if we can get this together as an ecosystem.
I think that's inspiring, John, and I think it's spot on. I do a lot of work with customers who are trying to get net new equipment, net new smart connected equipment into the brilliant manufacturing or smart manufacturing space. And a lot of that is to do with net new business models. And I think the convergence of people, process, and tech to unlock these new business models is what's going to drive adoption and drive success and hit the big key outcomes like productivity, not just adoption for adoption's sake. So I think that's perfect. So we've talked a little bit about the value, what value means. We've talked about the technology. Before we get to Q&A, I would love to just touch on challenges. So Zev, like me, you've probably got a few kind of earned gray hairs in your beard from playing in this space for a couple of years. So I'd love to hear from you what challenges you think manufacturers face when it comes to adopting manufacturing OT or manufacturing technology.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So I've got a framework for this one too.
Great.
And I was hoping I could pivot just a little bit here. So I did a good talk on this framework at Aviva World, but I want to pull one topic out of there in particular. It's what I describe as the data mega silos as one of my three major challenges. And it's so closely related to what we've been discussing around connectivity and interoperability. So I thought maybe just to continue this thread of conversation, I'd share some thoughts on that if that's okay.
Yeah.
So first, I think about connectivity and interoperability as two separate but interrelated topics. Connectivity in my mind is if I spring up a new device, can I get the data off of it? Can I move data from here to here? And we've just seen tremendous improvements in connectivity over the last 10, 15 years. You know, OSIsoft right now that made the Pi system, now part of Aviva. Their original claim to fame was that they had 400 interfaces that could connect to anything, right? You have some sort of legacy thing that only speaks a particular kind of like a broken OPC protocol. They've created a custom interface to go get data off of it. And that was an awesome innovation in the early 2000s. But now we've got like MQTT, OPC UA, so many things are plug and play to get the connectivity moving that I think I don't want to go on record saying connectivity has been solved, but I think as Tanya pointed out, connectivity is now assumed. We have just tremendous opportunities for connectivity. Interoperability, in my view, is more a question of contextualization. It's fine to move the data from here to here, but do I know what it represents? I describe it as this problem, and this is still a problem in almost every client I work with. If I go to an engineer in a plant and I walk onto the plant floor and I point to a heat exchanger, can he tell me where the data is that shows me the efficiency of that heat exchanger, or even just the temperature sensor on that heat exchanger? If he wants to pull up that trend, can he do it? And we're still in a world where the answer is not clearly yes. The answer is, well, maybe I go down the hall and I talk to this guy and he knows the unique tag name of that particular thing, and then I can go find it. So this contextualization problem, do I know what the data represents, is really important, and the key, in my view, to interoperability. Well, more and more, my job as a system integrator in industrial IoT is mapping. And I think, John, you were mentioning this earlier. I have to map data from this system to this system. And it is fine for us to say, as technologists in the software industry, that we need to solve this with technology. But I don't know that we're going to get there with the current levels of artificial intelligence available to us, because contextualization is a cognitive problem. It requires human cognitive understanding. And until we have a general AI, we're not going to be able to just deploy interoperability, no matter how much we work together as an ecosystem. And that in no way is to undermine anything Jim or John you said. There's tremendous improvements we can make in interoperability. I just want to voice the note of caution that interoperability really leans into people and process. We need to provide tools to engineers and operators so that they can build the contextualizations they need. They can do the data mappings they need without building, creating a whole team of system integrators to go do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And just to add to that a little bit, because we haven't touched on it on the talk, and I know we're coming up into Q&A, but kind of connectivity interoperability has an evil cousin called cybersecurity, and that's another significant kind of issue or item to think about. It's, as I've said, really easy to connect two things together. To pull some data and send it somewhere else requires some work to contextualize it. But then there's a question of can you secure? How secure is it? Can someone get in through that? Is there an exploit that can be used? Is the data secured? This is something that we see as a we actually see customers going back. We've seen customers who are running public cloud industrial software who have pulled it back into their own data centers because they believe that they can no longer keep it secure in the cloud and can no longer allow the cloud to talk directly into the plant. So that's an exception, I would say, and they're actually coming back towards putting it back up into the cloud, but it's a real concern and actually a real driver for a lot of our customers.
That's such an important check, Keith. I can't talk about. I get so excited about delivering value that I'm going to end up getting fired. But thanks for bringing us back to earth on that. Cybersecurity is so important.
And for those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend Countdown to Zero Day: The Story of Stuxnet. If you're not focused on cybersecurity when you talk about connectivity and interoperability and OT systems, boy, will you be after you read that book. Stuxnet is a scary, scary story. So let's jump over to Q&A, and I appreciate everyone's input so far. A great question here from Monica, if I understand the context correctly. And maybe, John, this is over to you since you brought up the idea of use case purgatory. But if a focus on use case delivers pilot purgatory, yet you need to show early ROI, and this is so important, what do you think is a path forward? And I've got some views on this one, but I'd love to hear your point, John. You. Yeah,
great question. And I think I need to make the distinction. Pilot purgatory is a thing, but I think it's a function of a bigger thing, which is use case purgatory. And that's the purgatory that I was kind of adding to the equation. It's the use case mentality and the historic legacy stovepipe architectures that have created the mess that we're in, that have created the technical debt that we're in. So I agree 100% that we need to take small steps, and whether you're a large manufacturer or a small manufacturer, you don't need $1 million of a capital project to get started. So bring that pilot team together and bring the proof of concept team together. But when 80+% of them fail to scale or fail in large measure to succeed, why is that? I think it's the same answers that have led us into this use case purgatory. It's the lack of scalability that comes from the lack of interoperability. And so if you put your pilot together, insist from your technology providers, from your implementation partners, insist on interoperability and dig into interoperability and make sure that you're not creating another island, not another stovepipe architecture. That is use case purgatory continued, and it's also pilot purgatory guaranteed.
John, I would so I agree with everything you said, and I take one slight different twist on that. And I would say that this is an issue of leadership.
Yeah.
So if a question is around an ROI on a pilot, or a question is around a technical proof of concept on a pilot, that to me, that gives signals to me right off the bat that there's a commitment and a leadership issue that needs to be addressed first.
Just to add on quickly to that and bring back a buzzword that we haven't mentioned yet. This to me is about IT/OT integration. There's an IT group that supports IT systems. There's an OT group that supports OT systems, and the two almost never talk. Now that problem's starting to be solved, but this entire topic is an area where IT can lean into OT to help with best practices around application rationalization, scalable architectures, integration. So much in OT organizations, you're focused on keeping the plant running. If you have a solution that an engineer wants, you just plug it in however you can. And that leads to exactly what you've been talking about, John.
Perfect. I think that's spot on. And I think we've got time for one last question, and it really is a follow-on. So selling value as incremental successes, are achieved is critical. What methods of selling value to a range of different user profiles is seen as best practice?
So I can just kick off a bit of an answer with that, and really just to make 2 points. So one is that, and we talked earlier that the definition of value isn't necessarily monetary. Value is what is valuable to the stakeholders that are involved, and those have changed significantly. But as we move to new business models, new software models, particularly cloud, as an example, we move to a subscription basis for software, and that changes how to measure or how to think about value. So it used to be our ROI was to look at how much money you can save and then compare that to how much money you spent to put the system in. In a subscription economy, it's much more about what is the sustained cost reduction that I can achieve using this particular piece of software, this piece of technology, and is that sustained cost saving? So I can save $100,000 every year. Is that more than what I pay for the software, which might be $50,000 every year? So the ROI equation is a little different. It's changing to more one of sustained value and operating costs as the business models kind of shift.
I think that's so important. And I think as you balance that incremental value with the sustained value, especially when you're supporting a SaaS model of how you've purchased a software, is absolutely critical. Any more thoughts from the team on best practices for how you go after incremental value before we wrap up?
I would just add that I think this is a discipline, as Zev just pointed out, this OT/IT convergence, or perhaps lack thereof, continues to haunt us. It's been 20 years where we've been talking about that, and I think there's some deep-rooted constraints that still prevent OT and IT from collaborating the way they need to, in an optimal way. And so I think OT and IT have to work more effectively together. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do here at SESME is to create the education for all those different stakeholders to understand the value and justification in a vendor agnostic or a neutral way, to understand their role in this process and understand how they can have this conversation about the value of smart manufacturing, and to take the right level of depth around that conversation. Yeah, it's about this use case, but let's look at the sustainability of this use case and the scale up of this use case and how it fits into a future-proof technology architecture, value creation environment, and that's also got to be part of the conversation.
Perfect. I think that is the perfect way to close our session today. So I think with that, I'd like to thank John, Jim, Tanya, Keith, Zev, and Lucian for hosting. This has been a great discussion, and hopefully everybody has learned something about how to accelerate time to value for your manufacturing investments.